want to welcome the people who are not in our class to the last in a series of 10 lectures, we think that that's the right number, on the 1970s. We have explored all various areas of the 1970s with one very significant exception, although there's been some mention in at least one of the lectures about it. And that is that the 1970s, one could say, began in 1969 outside a gay bar in Greenwich Village with could call it a rebellion, could call it a riot, could call it a police riot. Anyway, it's come down to us through history known as the Stonewall Rebellion. Some of you may recall way back in February when somebody, that would be me, gave an initial lecture in which I noted that there is a direct line from Stonewall in '69 to marriage equality in 2013. And that line goes through a very important decade in terms of the development of gay consciousness, gay liberation movements, and gay pride, a whole host of things that happened in the 1970s that many of us who are straight, who had no idea about it as the 1970s dawned, and we all learned a tremendous amount, and I personally learned a tremendous amount from the man who's standing here, because this is Alan Young, who has been a friend of mine since I was in high school, which is before 1960. Alan grew up in rural New York. His family ran a chicken farm, and he went to high school in rural New York State, then went to Columbia University. Professionally trained as a journalist, holds 2 master's degrees, one in Latin American Studies from Stanford University and one in journalism from the Columbia School of Journalism. After 3 years in Latin America, during which he became fluent in both Portuguese, the Brazilian variety, and Spanish. What kind of Spanish accent do you have, Mexican?
I would say just general, medium to good accent.
3 years in Brazil and Chile, where he actually, I got so excited in Chile that I went there to do my PhD research a few years later. Came back to the States, assuming he was going to have a tremendous career as a journalist, which he did, but not the one he expected. He took a job with the Washington Post, and he might have been Carl Bernstein, but in 1967, he skipped town. He jumped ship, as it were, and went to work for a rival organization known as Liberation News Service. Liberation News Service was the Associated Press of the left in the 1960s and 70s, producing packets for underground newspapers and college newspapers and providing a decidedly different approach to the news. He worked with LNS for a number of years, but in 1969, I would venture to say inspired by Stonewall, came out as a gay man, joined the Gay Liberation Front, and got very involved in the gay liberation movement. I'm not going to tell you more about him. I'll let him tell you more about himself and about gay liberation in the 1970s. Alan Young.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to try and talk for, somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes, and then have opportunity for people to ask questions and have a discussion or leave early, whatever you want to do. I was telling, I'm staying with a couple of gay men, friends of mine who live in Soho, that I was talking about the 70s, and one of them said, "Oh, I hope you talk about the hair, because Farrah Fawcett, she had the best hair in the 70s. So I said, well, I think it's going to be a little bit more about the politics than about fashion. So that was kind of a stereotype. I think he was just joking with me. This is an amazing time to talk about this topic. And it was only a few weeks ago that the President of the United States endorsed same-sex marriage and mentioned the word Stonewall. I think many of you remember he talked about Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall. And wow, when I heard that, I got chills. I really did, because who would have thought in 1969 or 1970 that the president would be talking about Stonewall? And it meant a lot, and a lot of my gay friends all commented on that, and a lot of my women friends too, and my black friends. That was a very interesting and important sentence in his speech. And as far as wow is concerned, the other wow we had was the coming out of the first male athlete in a major sport, Jason Collins, a black gay man, and that was very big news, front page news in many newspapers, in the media. He's the cover of the Sports Illustrated that comes out today. And the same last couple of weeks, we had legalized same-sex marriage take place in France, New Zealand, state of Rhode Island. Not long ago, we had the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, so that gay people can serve openly in the military. And I'm going to spend a little time going back before Stonewall, just to kind of set the stage about why this political movement was launched in 1969 in the wake of a fairly routine police raid on a gay bar. And I want to mention two documentary films. Any of you who really are interested in finding out more about this topic, I recommend these two films. One is, they both have very simple titles, Before Stonewall and After Stonewall. And the documentary films made by a man named John Scagliotti, who's still making movies, by the way. So I think that we need to talk about what was gay life about before Stonewall. And one thing that it was about more than anything else was repression. And the history of that repression is major. You can go back to Oscar Wilde, who was imprisoned in England for what he called the love that dare not speak its name. Some people now say it's the love that won't shut up. Certainly, I mean, Wilde went to prison. A great English writer, E.M. Forster, wrote numerous novels. One of the novels he wrote was a gay love story. The title was Maurice. That book wasn't published until after he died. He put an embargo on the book, so it was never published while he was alive, even though he was one of the best-known English authors. Walt Whitman, considered one of the great American poets. If you read his poetry carefully, you can see that he was a gay man, but it was worded very, very cautiously, and certainly for many, many decades, people who studied American literature avoided that subject, and those poems were very often not included in anthologies or even discussed by people who studied literature. So that's a little sample of repression on a kind of cultural level. What were the things that were said about homosexuality? Well, in many cases, nothing was said. It wasn't, the word gay certainly wasn't in the media. The word homosexual was very rarely in the media. It wasn't the dictionary, I know, because I used to look at dictionaries and look at that word when I was young, because it meant something to me. And I think basically homosexuals were considered to be immoral people. We were considered to be bad people. We were considered to be sinners by people who read scripture, all the major religions, probably even all the minor religions. Students were expelled from colleges, and I'm not just talking about Brigham Young University, the Mormon school in Utah, where they still expel gay students, but even colleges here in New York City and Ivy League schools and schools all over. If you were known to be gay, you would be expelled because you were immoral. And this went on, you know, for decades and decades, well into the 60s. In the McCarthy era, we all know that McCarthy ran a relentless campaign against communists and communist sympathizers and liberals, the red hysteria. He also went after what he called perverts. And the word perverts was used in the New York Times in a headline, as if, not in quotations either. So many people were fired from the jobs in the American government for that reason. I think one of the most serious aspects of this repression was what we sometimes call the medical model. In modern medicine, especially the psychiatric profession, they were convinced that homosexuality was an illness. And there were different ways in which they dealt with it. They had aversion therapy, where they would, if you were taken to a psychiatrist that liked aversion therapy, they would show you a picture of a naked man. If you were a gay man and getting this therapy, they would show you a picture of a naked man, and you would get some sort of medication that would make you throw up, things like that. And if you were a better off, more middle class or upper middle class gay man and you went to a Freudian analyst, you'd sit on a couch forever, supposedly to get cured, but it didn't really work. But that was pretty standard. And they had their ideas about what caused homosexuality. And the most common thing was dominant mother and passive father. And boy, that covers an awful lot of families. And then you'd have twin brothers, where one would be gay and one would be straight, or brothers that weren't twins, just regular brothers. So these theories were really without any merit, but they were very popular. And many of these psychiatrists wrote books. They gave lectures. They had professorships in the medical schools in this city. And the laws were, and the books were against the sexual acts that the gay people used, and many of those sexual acts actually heterosexual people used. Anything to do with oral or anal sex was considered a crime against nature. And people were actually imprisoned for these crimes. When I was in the early 1970s, when I got involved with the gay movement, I received a communication from a friend of mine who heard about a gay man in prison in Massachusetts. His name was Eddie Rastellini, and I went to interview him. And he was jailed because of violating the sodomy law, and that was in the 60s. And then I think it's also important to think about, the issue of what happened to gay people in the prisons. The prisons were very repressive environments, and the immigration laws were very strict. Interestingly enough, a lawyer who Michael knew years ago, she was best known, I think, for helping left-wingers and communists avoid deportation in the McCarthy period. She also took a case to the Supreme Court on behalf of a gay man from Canada who was denied the right to immigrate into the United States because he was gay. Her name was Blanche Friedman, and that was one of the first cases brought before the United States Supreme Court. Gay people called the cops Lily Law. That was a little nickname that we gave to them, little campy nickname. And the cops could be very brutal. Bar raids were pretty standard. And even so-called liberals and leftists were not necessarily favorable to gay people. The Communist Party and other left-wing organizations expelled gay people too in this period. And if you go back to the early history of the Bolsheviks, they had more liberal attitudes, but under Stalin things were changed, and they took a very strong anti-gay position. And I grew up in this atmosphere, and people, all gay people grew up in this atmosphere, and you became enveloped in fear or shame. It was very, very difficult. Suicide rate was high, a lot of suffering. And our social lives also, I think, involve repression. The ways of meeting people were fairly limited. People talked about the 3 Bs, the bars, the baths, and the bushes. And for women, I think it was even more difficult, places to socialize and meet. And sometimes it was even dangerous. Were there romantic relationships, same-sex relationships? There certainly were, but they weren't common. There's some wonderful books that have been published that people have found some old photographs of gay couples from the early 20th century. So it showed that some people did find love and romance, but it wasn't common. It was difficult. There was some organizing in the pre-Stonewall era. There was a gay organization in Chicago in the 20s, which was very short-lived. A man named Magnus Hirschfeld, who was Jewish, founded the Scientific Humanitarian Institute in Germany, and the Nazis took over his library, trashed the place, burned all the books, and he escaped to France. He's lucky he wasn't killed. A man named Harry Hay started an organization in 1948 called Bachelors for Wallace. Henry Wallace was a candidate that ran against Harry Truman and Thomas Dewey in 1948, and this morphed into one of the first gay organizations called the Managing Society. There was a similar organization in Washington, D.C., founded by Frank Kameny, who was an astronomer who worked for the American government, who was fired because he was gay, and he wanted to get his job back. He took his case all the way to the Supreme Court, and they wouldn't hear his case. They said it was justified for him to be fired on moral grounds. There were demonstrations every year at the Independence Hall. It was called the Annual Reminder. And in 1968, before Stonewall, student organizations formed at Columbia and Cornell, the Student Homophile League. They didn't use the word gay, and they didn't use the word lesbian then. The women had an organization called the Daughters of Bilitis, and they had some publications. The Postal Service denied them the right to send their publications in the mail. And that case was also taken to the Supreme Court. And in that case, the gay publications actually won. So there were some victories. But these pre-Stonewall things were really quite small. Evelyn Hooker, I'm trying to mention a few more of them. The Kinsey Report in 1948 was very important because the survey that he and his colleagues undertook showed that the number of people who either were identified as gay or at least engaged in homosexual acts was much larger than what people thought. And a pioneering and brave psychologist named Evelyn Hooker did studies of gay men and lesbians, and she wrote very important papers and did a lot of public speaking to say, look, these people aren't sick. You know, this is a myth to say that they're sick. It's not scientifically accurate. And in the 1960s, which predated the Stonewall, was such a time of ferment with the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the rise of the feminist movement, the Young Lords in New York, which was a Puerto Rican organization. There was just so much going on. The counterculture, so-called hippie movement, all started to influence the culture, and the word liberation began to be used a lot. And in the Third World, the word liberation was used. And of course, we had an anti-war movement. The Vietnamese people fighting for their independence, they called themselves in South Vietnam the National Liberation Front. So the word liberation was out there. The word freedom was out there. And I think that was something that began to affect gay people. So one day there was a police raid at the Stonewall Inn. Almost all the gay bars were run by the mafia. And this police raids were common. Very often people were taken into custody. Sometimes they were given tickets for disorderly conduct. Mostly they were after the bar owners because they were getting paybacks. So if the bar owners didn't give adequate paybacks, the cops would come and just cause a hassle. On this particular night, as Michael said when introducing me, people fought back. So that was a really big deal, and there were they used the term, both the terms riots and rebellion have been used, and there was fighting in the streets, and they lighted a fire, and the cops were scared, and they locked themselves inside the bar, and it was quite something. And this, I think, was a big moment, and I think what made Stonewall a big moment was not the raid itself, but the meeting that took place shortly after that. And the meeting was attended by a variety of people, and I wasn't there. And I didn't even know about Stonewall, what happened in Stonewall. There was a tiny little article in the New York Times, and there was something in the Village Voice, but it certainly wasn't national news. So a few people from the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis and some street kids and transgender people, drag queens that were getting hassled by the cops, they got together and they had a meeting at a place called Alternate U at the intersection of 14th Street and 6th Avenue. Alternate U was a place where there were classes and left-wing organizations and peace organizations regularly met there. And the people who went to this meeting, they said, we need to organize. We need to take this past this little street demonstration that we had. We need to organize and try and fight for our rights and fight for liberation. And they chose the name Gay Liberation Front. And one of the things that they focused on was the idea that they wanted, or we wanted, to be part of this revolutionary movement that was already happening. Some of it was Marxist-oriented or socialist-oriented. Some of it had to do with combating racism, definitely had to do with being anti-war, and creating a new society, which was projected by the hippies and the counterculture. And a lot of the literature that came out at the time, a lot of the poetry and the writing that was being done through the beat movement. So people got together and started meeting on a regular basis. They started putting out a new newspaper, which was called Come Out. And these meetings were pretty chaotic and anarchic. They were not very well structured, but it was very exciting. And for a lot of people, this was the first time that they were, defining gay as a political issue. And it was really quite amazing to have this happen. There were small collectives. I was in one of them. I was in a loft on 17th Street. It was called the 17th Street Collective. And we also addressed the social issues. We said we have to find ways of meeting and one another and socializing other than these dreary bars run by the mafioso. And they established a group within the Gay Liberation Front, started organizing dances at Alternate U. And that was very important because it was providing a social alternative. Now what happened was, I think there was this desire to be part of this revolutionary movement. So who came to these Gay Liberation Front meetings? They were street kids, transgender people. I interviewed a transgender person named Marsha P. Johnson, who became fairly well known. And she was basically a hustler because there weren't jobs available for a man who was dressing as a woman. There were people like me who had experience in the left, left-wing activists who had, suddenly said, I'm fighting for liberation and peace, but what about my own personal liberation? And we taught each other. We were the teachers of each other. And I learned a lot from the people that I went to these meetings with every week. And we did a lot of things. We had marches at different times. Police were hassling people in Times Square, and we had a march, and we went downtown, and we demonstrated outside the Women's House of Detention. And that was very exciting. A friend of mine just put together a little pamphlet about that. And people heard about us all over the country, and other people started groups they called the Gay Liberation Front in Chicago and Atlanta and New Orleans and San Francisco and many other, in Los Angeles, and even in smaller communities and colleges. So this movement started to grow, and it was very different from the old homophile movement that I mentioned before, because it was filled with hippies and radicals who were, didn't really give a damn about much as far as they weren't really afraid. There was a fearlessness, and that was being shown by a much larger number of people. And we didn't have professional athletes. We didn't have professional entertainers. We didn't have politicians that held public office. We didn't have doctors and lawyers and stockbrokers. We didn't have gay Republicans. I mean, it was a very much a kind of a ragtag group in many ways that was stirring things up and making changes. I think for some of the people, however, this was not a pathway to making long-lasting change. So after a few months, there were a group of people who split off, and they called themselves the Gay Activist Alliance. Now, why did they split off? They split off for a few reasons. Some of them, I think, were men who didn't really like lesbians. There were very few lesbians who went along with the Gay Activist Alliance, but it was mostly men, because in the Gay Liberation Front, we were agreeing to give a lot more voice to the lesbians that were in our group, who were a smaller number, but not that small. Maybe 30% were women. So there was a substantial lesbian presence, but the lesbians didn't like the fact that the world seemed to assume that gay meant male. So they said, we don't want to just have the word gay. We want to say gay and lesbian. And we agreed that made a lot of sense to us. They wanted to have a dance just for women, and we agreed that made sense. I think some of these other men, they didn't like that. They felt that the lesbians were getting too much space or something. I'm not really sure. So they left and started another organization. But it wasn't just that issue. And they also didn't like the fact that we were supporting the Black Panther Party. I think that many of us felt that the best way to combat racism was to support the Black Panther Party, because the Black Panther Party was very militant and very visible. I personally think that that was a mistake, because I think our emphasis should have been reaching out to African Americans who were already active in the gay community, rather than trying to make ourselves looked favorably upon by the Black Panthers. There were some benefits to that, though, because Huey Newton, who was the leader of the Black Panthers, issued a very strong statement supporting gay liberation, and that was seen as very important. And we were invited to attend a series of meetings called the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention. But I think there were a lot of gay people who said, you know, fighting for a revolution sounds like a good idea, but maybe there's not going to be a revolution. Maybe we just need to get some rights in this society. And I think then at that moment, the gay movement took a turn away from this strong, revolutionary, left-wing kind of pathway toward a more, perhaps you might want to use the word assimilationist. That word is sometimes too loaded. But toward a pathway that would focus on gay issues focus on the gay movement as a single issue kind of movement. And after the Gay Activist Alliance was formed, there was another national organization formed called the National Gay Task Force, which later became the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, which still exists, and then the Human Rights Campaign, which also still exists. And things happened in rural areas. There was a little magazine published in Iowa called RFD, which I started to write for because I had left New York and was living in a rural area. So we were trying to get the idea across that you didn't have to come to the big city to be gay and to be open about who you were. We were educating ourselves in many ways and looking for alternatives. People who were interested in athletics, you know, the stereotype was that gay men weren't athletic and that the lesbians were all gym teachers. Well, that was, of course, like a lot of stereotypes, just not really true. But certainly there were a lot of athletes, both male and female, in the gay community. And people came up with the idea of the Gay Olympics. And the National Olympic Committee sued and said, you can't use the word Olympics, even though they had, I think, a lot of other organizations use the word Olympics. So that's what started what's called the Gay Games, and that's been going on now for about 35 years. In some cities, gay rights ordinances were passed. One of them was Miami, and then a woman named Anita Bryant. How many people here have heard of Anita Bryant? Oh, quite a few of you. Well, Anita Bryant was a singer, but she and her husband, whose name was Bob Green, started an organization called Save Our Children. She and he put forward this idea, which is, I think, still held by many people. Well, gay people can't reproduce, so they have to recruit, and they go after our children. So they called their campaign Save Our Children. And she had a very good gig as a spokesman for the Florida Citrus Commissions, selling orange juice. And the gay community responded to her quite strongly, boycotting orange juice. You couldn't get a screwdriver in the gay bars for quite a long time. But she was successful in overturning the gay rights law in the city of Miami. When I say gay rights, it's an anti-discrimination law that protected people against discrimination. And those kinds of laws exist now in only about 20 of the states. In many states in the United States, you can still be fired if you're gay, denied a room in a hotel, denied a seating in a restaurant, and so on.